Session 3 looks at the city, energy, the environment, and resilience. The chairperson for the session is Dr. Noeleen Heyzer. Dr. Heyzer is an Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and the highest-ranking Singaporean in the UN system. Dr. Heyzer was the first woman to serve as the Executive Secretary of the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Heyzer and the speakers whom she will introduce to the stage. Dr. Heyzer, please.
Thank you. Very good afternoon, everyone. And I'm sure that after all the very exciting times that you had this morning till now, it's going to be a real challenge for this session. But thank you for being here. I can promise you that it's going to be an equally exciting session. Well, the topic before us for session 3 is the city, our environment, the energy, and resilience. The reason for having a topic like this is because, ladies and gentlemen, we have only one planet to share. And 2015 is a milestone year for all our member states of the United Nations. They are deciding on the Sustainable Development Agenda. And this is because they see that in order to sustain our world, we need a transformational agenda that is planet-sensitive and that is people-centered and people-focused. We have one planet to share. What does that mean? It means that climate change and the threats to our ecosystems are indeed the biggest challenge of our generation. And it's a challenge for humanity. Our challenge, and we have heard this many times, we still have poverty. Asia is rising, but we still have people living in poverty. And therefore, the challenge is, how do we reduce poverty? How do we generate prosperity, but at the same time, leave a very much lower carbon footprint? And this requires us to have a shift in our paradigm. The thing is that there are certain things that are certain trends, global trends and regional trends that will continue. We will be an urbanizing, Asia will be an urbanizing world. In fact, by 2050, 60% of the developing world will be living in cities, and 85% of the developed world will be living in cities. And our cities, unfortunately, is the source of our carbon footprint. In fact, our cities actually generates up to 70% of greenhouse gas emission. And therefore, one of the challenges that we have in front of us as we think of our future is how do we actually reduce our reliance on fossil fuel? Because this is still the energy source that many of our cities, as well as our industrialization and our economies, are highly dependent on. And we need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuel in order to keep global temperature increasing to less than 2 degrees. But that's the only way in which we actually prevent the type of climate disasters that we actually see in the crystal ball coming to us. And therefore, what type of urban future can we have? What are some of the issues that we will be talking about at this panel? I think if we are to urbanize, there are different ways in which we can urbanize. What is the meaning of sustainable urbanization? How do we design our cities in a way that allows it to be more effective, more efficient, and also more integrated, to be more multi-centered? How do we make sure that our buildings are more energy efficient? How do we ensure that our transport systems are more energy efficient as well. And the main reason is because our buildings and our transport systems are really the main cause of our carbon emissions. And therefore, there are many challenges, including how do we design our cities in such a way that we have green spaces, that it is not just about infrastructure, but it's also one that allows people to move easily in order to access the type of services that we provide in our city so that it is livable. There are many ways of describing cities in this new way. People talk about eco-cities. People recently talk about smart cities. We talk about sustainable cities, livable cities, inclusive cities. But these are all ways that actually start us to think about the type of cities that we would like to live in and can design. I think, but the other challenge, of course, is the fact that our economies are run now very much on an energy that is highly dependent on fossil fuel. And that in fact, there will be more of an increase in the use of fossil fuel. And therefore, how do we ensure that in the next phase, in the energy systems, we have to be able to leapfrog in a way that will allow us to think of a carbon-based economy to one that is more highly dependent on clean energy. So these are some of the things that we will be talking about. But I also would like to talk about the other issue of resilience. Asia-Pacific, as many of you know, is also one of the most disaster-prone areas in the world. And therefore, when we design our cities and we design our buildings and our transport systems, how do we do it in such a way that it is disaster resilient? But disasters and shocks is something that we will be very much the landscape of our future. And not just disasters based on natural disasters, but also man-made disasters in terms of the financial shocks, but also health disasters. And therefore, really dealing with resilience in new ways that builds not just the building codes and so on, but also building communities. So these are all issues that we will be taking on this afternoon. And it is my pleasure to be able to introduce two really outstanding speakers. Our first speaker is Mr. Peter Schwartz, and he's the Senior Vice President of Strategic Planning for Salesforce.com. And in this role, he manages the organization's ongoing strategic conversation and help provide insight into the future. And before co-founding his own firm, he was head of the scenario planning for Shell, an internationally renowned futurist and business strategist. He specializes in scenario planning and has worked along with corporations and governments and institutions to create alternative perspectives for the future. So we look very much to the way he would predict our future. Our second speaker is Dr. Liu Achitects, who is a renowned architect and planner. And he's the director of RSP Architects, Planners, and Engineers, a consulting firm with prospects in Singapore and a dozen cities. He's the founding chairman of the Center for Liveable Cities that was established in 2008. And Dr. Liu has served as the adjunct professor of the School of Design and Environment and the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. As an architect planner and the chief executive officer of the Singapore Housing and Development Board, he also foresaw the completion of over 500,000 dwelling units. And he also became the chief executive officer and chief planner of the Urban Redevelopment Authority, for which he spearheaded the major revisions of the Singapore concept plans. So we have before us, ladies and gentlemen, two really very outstanding speakers. And I would like them to come in. They will speak for 20 minutes each, and then we will take questions and answers from there. So enjoy the ride. Could I invite you, Mr. Peter Schwartz, to come and take the floor?
Thank you. Before I get into my formal remarks, I want to say thank you. First of all, to Jillian Coe and her team for organizing this amazing event, and my dear friend Kishore Mahbubani for having my wife and I as guests here. I consider it a great privilege to be here. I have enormous admiration for Singapore and what it has accomplished. I've had the privilege of coming here many times over the last 30 years and working with virtually every leader of Singapore, from Tharman, who's a good friend, Vivian Balakrishnan, of course, Lee Kuan Yew, the current Prime Minister, Tommy Koh, dear friend. So I consider myself in a community of friends, and I'm delighted to be here. What I want to talk about today, is our moderator suggested, is what I think is the greatest crisis facing the human species in not just our lifetime, but in the last 10,000 years. We are facing an enormous challenge created by what we have done to the climate. I'm not a Catholic, you might guess, but I had great admiration for what the Pope did just 2 weeks ago in his encyclical on climate change, in bringing climate change and poverty together and seeing it not just as a scientific or an economic issue, but a moral issue. And I think he has changed the frame for talking about this crisis that the world faces. And so I really have great admiration for the risk that the Pope took. Even a Pope who speaks to God takes risks. So I am delighted that he took that risk in all our behalves. Now, when I talk about climate change, what I'm talking about is the gradual warming of the Earth and the gradual rise of the sea. But in fact, I was involved in the very, very first climate assessment in 1977, when we started modeling the change, and have been involved in that work ever since. And one of the things that is clear to me is that climate change is not a distant prospect, not something for 30, 50, 100 years into the future. The tipping point in climate change was 25 or 30 years ago. We're already past that point. Climate is changing. It is not something we look forward to in the future. It is something that is underway today. And in fact, it's not just about a gradual warming of the Earth. What happens is all that energy is absorbed, it has to go somewhere. It heats the air, it heats the water, or it heats the land. And as a result, what you get is increasing violence, increasing disturbances in the climate. What we are seeing is a world driven by increasing weather extremes, droughts, storms, floods, tornadoes all over the world. Today in London, it's about 100 degrees. Anybody who's been watching Wimbledon has seen what's going on. In California, it's a similar, the whole northern hemisphere is having a heat wave as we speak. This isn't a normal, average phenomenon. This is part of the symptoms of climate change. And indeed, this part of the world will experience it rather profoundly, in my view. We touched earlier on the issue of water. Well, what we're going to see is the Mekong River, which begins in the high Himalayas and goes through 6 countries before it reaches the sea. And every one of those countries depends upon it for water, for irrigation, for fish farming, for growing rice, and so on. And every one of them wants to dam it for one reason or another, mostly for electric power or preserving it for irrigation. And so what worries me in that scenario of the Mekong beginning to dry up is not just merely the consequences for the local environment, but for conflict itself. So climate change can lead not just simply to poverty, but it can lead to war and conflict as well. So this is a civilizational issue. Now, from the point of view of Singapore, you have an option. You can be a free rider. That is, you don't matter. You're tiny. The amount of CO2 that you produce, frankly, is largely irrelevant to the problem. You could continue, you could burn coal, you could do almost anything you wanted, and frankly, almost no one would notice. You're too small. But your moral position, your political position, your social position in the world would be profoundly undermined as a free rider. So I'm going to accept the point of view that you don't want to be a free rider, that you want to be moral, that you want to take an appropriate position in the world, and I will begin from that assumption, because history seems to suggest that that is true about Singapore. So I'm going to assume that you actually want to do something about this. Now, unfortunately, the sea is going to rise. It's already beginning to. And this is the mouth of the Rhine River. It is a flood barrier that the Dutch have built because they're beginning to prepare for that world of a higher sea level. Now, anybody who's been to the Netherlands knows that most of the country is already below sea level. They've built dikes. In fact, they estimate that they have spent about $1 trillion since the 17th century building dikes to protect themselves. And they estimate they're going to have to spend $2 trillion for the next generation of dikes because of rising sea levels. So what you will have to deal with on a smaller scale is very much what the Dutch have had to deal with over the last few centuries. And before too long, you will be building dikes like the Dutch. So you have something to learn from them as well. Now, what this really comes down to mostly is the question of how we produce and how we use energy. And the conventional wisdom in the world today is that the real growth in energy consumption is in places like China and India, and the richer, older countries like the United States and Europe, UK, Japan are slowing down. And that is true in slowing down in their consumption, in part because they have more modern and efficient systems, in part because they're not growing as fast. So that combination of relatively slower growth and more efficient technologies is flattening out their energy consumption. In fact, the United States may have already passed what we can call peak demand for oil. We may never use as much oil in the future as we did in 2009. So technology can have a big impact, and modernization can have an enormous impact, and China and India will eventually get there. But their growth in population and growth in the economy will mean that they will continue to consume enormous amounts of energy in the future. Now, furthermore, what we have also seen is a rather dramatic rise in renewable energy. Now, if you look at this chart, what you will see is that the big blue zone in the middle is what we have had for renewable energy for a very long time, hydroelectric. Now, unfortunately, there aren't that many more opportunities for it. And there's that little yellow line there, that's called solar power. That's how much solar has risen over the last 20 years or so. And solar is growing, and it's growing all over the world, but it is still a tiny fraction of the electricity that we produce. Wind is growing fast, and it's a meaningful fraction, but it's also still a small fraction of the energy we use. Now, both of these can contribute in the long run, obviously, and will have an enormous impact. But what we've seen is that overall, that what we're seeing still is more coal around the world. We're producing more coal in India, more coal in China, and even in Europe, where Germany, who decided they're not going to use nuclear power, is actually now consuming more coal, and their CO2 emissions are rising because they got scared of nuclear power, and I'm going to come back to that. But as a result, they're importing dirty electricity from Poland, and of course, nasty nuclear power from France. So they've abandoned their nuclear in the interests of producing nuclear from the French, because they can afford the risk, of course, and dirty power from Poland. But what we're seeing is just a little bit of nuclear now in the world, and still lots more coal. And every ton of coal we mine means lots more CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, one of the things we are seeing that is, I think, a very important thing is that, in fact, we're seeing growth in the economy, but without equivalent growth in energy as we become much more efficient. However, more per capita, more people in the world, even as the world's population adds another billion or two over the next 50 years, will still inevitably mean more energy consumption, even if the per capita consumption goes down. There's just more capitas. So we're going to see energy consumption continue to rise, and especially electricity, because electricity is the fuel, the energy source of the modern era. Now, from a Singaporean perspective, you have a lot of opportunity to reduce the demand for energy. You're already pretty efficient, but you still can get much, much better. And there are obviously three places where that can happen. The first, and is already well underway, is efficient buildings. The buildings, the designs themselves, how we use electricity in the buildings, cooling, lighting, probably not heating in this part of the world, elevators, etc., all of those things can become ever more efficient. And they are. And there's still a great deal of potential in that respect. The second is land use, how you actually distribute economic and human activity on the land. And again, you're being very intelligent about this, but it is one of the biggest levers. It is not an accident that the most efficient energy, from an energy point of view, city in the United States is Manhattan. high population density, build vertically, insulate the buildings. Most people walk to work or walk places because the traffic is so bad. They don't own cars because there's no point in it. They take mass transit and taxis, etc. So from that point of view, Manhattan is actually one of the most efficient places in the world. You are more like Manhattan than anywhere else. And the truth of the matter is, over time, you're going to go more vertical and more dense, and that's one of the ways you will achieve efficiency. And then the final step is, of course, electric vehicles. The move away from the internal combustion engine toward electric cars. And there, the interesting question we'll come back to is, where does the electricity come from? Because, of course, an EEV is actually a ZEV. That means, a ZEV, zero-emission vehicles, is actually an EEV, an elsewhere emission vehicle. It doesn't come out of the car, it comes from somewhere else. And so the somewhere else actually does matter. But we're seeing enormous improvements in electric vehicles, both in terms of the quality of the batteries, the drivetrains, and so on. My wife drives an i3, BMW i3. We love it. She hasn't been to a gasoline station, petrol station in 2 years. And so it's a big step forward. So we're going to see continued improvement in that. So Singapore has an enormous opportunity to still reduce its energy consumption even as it continues to grow. And of course, the final thing, which I didn't touch on, is the mix of industries. Some industries are more energy intensive, some are less. But as long as, for example, you have petroleum refining here in the neighborhood, you'll still be using a fair amount of energy in those industries. But the service industries, tourism, and so on, all provide you, healthcare, provide you an opportunity to reduce energy consumption in the economy. Now, there are a few potentially game-changing technologies out there when you look on the supply side of things. The first thing is, if you really do have to radically reduce your CO2 emissions and can't substitute other fuels for natural gas, which produces almost all of your electricity, we may get fortunate in discovering ways to capture the carbon and sequester it. And if we develop good technologies, which do not exist today, but good carbon capture and sequestration technologies, that can change the game in a very big way, because it means we can continue to use hydrocarbon fuels. Second, reducing the cost of solar. And of course, the biggest thing that has happened with solar power is the Chinese. Huge volume production has lowered the cost of solar power and will continue to around the world. So the cost of solar will continue to come down. Storage. If you could store that electricity overnight, that would have a very big effect. And today, for example, Tesla, the company that's producing electric cars, has recently introduced what they call their power wall, which is basically taking all those batteries that are in the car and just mounting them on the wall and powering them with solar power. And so at night, you can actually run off your batteries when you capture the energy from the sun. So there are ways you can begin to think about that in terms of a breakthrough in energy storage. And finally, the really big one, which no one can predict, the question of fusion power. Do we actually develop fusion power, which would change the game and move us away altogether from hydrogen, from hydrocarbons? But none of those are predictable. None of those exist today. We cannot be certain that any of them will be practical in the next 50 years. So when you look at things, first of all, solar is getting cheaper. It will continue to get cheaper. There's every reason to think it will improve, but it's a slow process. Secondly, what we're seeing is the same thing with batteries. Batteries have been around for a long time. The lithium-ion battery has been around for about 20 years. It will continue to improve, but there is no imminent breakthrough in sight in either one of these. So what it means is that they'll get a bit cheaper with volume over time, but neither one of them has the capacity to radically change the system in the short run. Now, when you think about all these sources, solar is expensive so far. It needs a lot of land, which you don't have. Hydro, as I suggested, raises issues like we've had on the Mekong River. Wind also takes a lot of land. It's unsightly. And geothermal is only available in a few places in the world. So most of these all face challenges. So in the end, if we're really serious about climate change, then we're facing one alternative. And that one alternative we actually have, which is nuclear power. Now, despite the events in Fukushima, despite the events at Chernobyl, if you look around the world at the nuclear power system, it has been mostly very safe. If you compare that to, say, coal, which kills about 20,000 miners every single year, and of course puts particulates in the air that cause an enormous amount of disease and death around the world, if the alternative is coal versus nuclear power, unquestionably, nuclear power is the better alternative. And I believe that within the next 50 years, Singapore will face the choice: natural gas and continue to be a free rider, or nuclear power and stop emitting CO2. That there will be no other alternative. Now, my dear friend Kishore, when I wrote an article about this in the Straits Times recently, wrote me a nasty note saying, "You've got this wrong. The people of Singapore will never take nuclear power, so forget it. It isn't going to happen." Well, Kishore, I think you're wrong. Because I think, in the end, I think the people of Singapore will be responsible, and also, nuclear power continues to advance. We're not stuck with old nuclear technologies. Today, there are a number of different nuclear technologies coming along that will have a profound alternatives. In fact, the one on your right is one that's being developed by Bill Gates. It's called TerraPower. It's his model for nuclear power. Bill's no dummy, and he thinks this is, in fact, the next wave of the future. But there are many alternatives. I'm showing here 6 different kinds of plant designs for the future. So we're not stuck with yesterday's technology. We're moving forward into a new generation of technologies that are safer, more efficient, lower cost, less likely to be consequential in its impact in terms of safety issues. So from a nuclear point of view, what I think Singapore will have is one of 3 alternatives. You're either going to float small nuclear plants offshore on big barges, you're going to build them underground, or you're going to build them in collaboration with your neighbors on one of the neighboring islands. I think it's going to be one of those 3 alternatives that will provide the nuclear power for Singapore in the next 50 years. So I think that is the technological alternative that you actually face. You're going to need electricity, and renewables will be insufficient. You're either going to have to continue to use natural gas, of which there's abundant natural gas. We don't need to worry about the supply side of that. Or you're going to have to move to nuclear power. Because, in fact, we're in a new world. We're in a world that I think is captured by this term positive environmentalism. And by that, what I mean simply is this: that today we live in what can be called the Anthropocene era, the era shaped by humankind. And the Anthropocene is not a new phenomenon, it's 10,000 years old. When we started developing agriculture around the world and stripping the forests of Europe and Asia and so on to grow agriculture, etc., we began to change the climate of the Earth 10,000 years ago. Now, it accelerated dramatically in the industrial era, but the planet's environment is no longer a natural environment as nature existed before humankind. We already shape the environment. The only question is we do it unconsciously, thoughtfully, and messily. We don't have a positive vision of the environment. And these are 3 books that are recent books. One is Whole Earth Discipline by my dear friend Stuart Brand and collaborator. Another is called The God Species by Mark Linus. And the last, which I really like the concept of the rambunctious garden. And this notion of the earth as a human garden. My wife is a great gardener. We live in a beautiful garden around my home. Kishore knows, he's shaking his head. He's been there many times. The point is that we need to be the gardeners of the planet. Because today, what we do is we mess up the planet. It's an empty, vacant lot. We've not taken good care of it. We now need to take good care of the garden. Because, in fact, that is what it is. It is no longer the world of the pre-human society of 10,000 years ago. It is a world that we are shaping. So the vision here is a very clear one. You have made this island a positive environment. You have shaped its environment. You have protected your green spaces. You've put in plants, gardens, parks all over that people can experience. This is how we have to view the planet. The way you have viewed this island, we all have to view our planet. We have to turn it into the world's most beautiful garden. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very outstanding presentation, Peter. Can I just say that the Secretary General of the UN launched a campaign, and this is the Sustainable Energy for All campaign. And the purpose of it was to recognize the fact that in our world today, even in Asia, you have about 1 billion people who still do not have access to modern electricity. And so you are talking about energy poverty on one hand. So one of the goals of that campaign is to have universal access to modern energy. The second one is, of course, to double up on energy efficiency. And this would open up a whole new market in terms of innovation and so on, in terms of increasing that efficiency. And the third goal is to double up on the renewables. And I see from your point is to also add the issue of clean energy to that mix. And of course, people are saying that we are still going to be very much fossil fuel based in the near future. And in fact, there is a major increase in that fossil fuel dependency, and the turn to natural gas is one of the way of trying to at least reduce some of the carbon emission, but also having technologies that deal with carbon capture and so on. And so how do you actually, in this transition, still try to reduce the threats to our climate change? But you went a step further to talk about nuclear energy, and I actually had a conversation with Bill Gates in 2008. And at that time, he actually said to me that he was leaving his foundation to spend 30 years, his next 30 years, investing in this nuclear energy. And I said, Bill, is that safe? Is that safe? What about the radiation and so on? And he said the new technologies would transform our world. So my question to you is that, how do you change people's mindset? Because after what happened with all the nuclear disasters, there is a lot of resistance to something like that. And I think that that's going to take quite a leap of imagination to think that that could be one of the futures that we will be going to.
Look, the issue of people's concerns are very real. Any technology has its trade-offs. It doesn't matter whether it's natural gas or coal or solar or wind or nuclear. Every one of them has its consequences. And the question is, which of those consequences can you live with most easily? Now, the truth is, I don't think we will make this choice thoughtfully or farsightedly. We will be driven to it. And we'll be driven to it by, unfortunately, climate disasters. You can see it coming. Probably the single biggest one will be in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is mostly under sea level already. A bit of sea level rise and a few major storms, and you'll find 160 million people leaving home without their Amex. And they will not be welcome next door. They were thrown out of India once before, and they're not going to be welcome in India this time. We are going to face, in the coastal zones of the world, again and again and again, serious issues. The Mekong Delta, as the sea level begins to rise and the salt line moves up the Mekong Delta and begins to affect rice production in that part of the world, or even moves even further and affects Tonle Sap, the lake that the Cambodians depend upon for their fish. If it begins to go salt, what happens to the fish? It'll be these environmental disasters that will push us to make the hard trade-offs that we need to make in choosing what are not always the best alternatives.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. Let us turn to the next speaker and to hear what the city of the future could look like from a Singapore perspective. Dr. Liu, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, the topic is ideas for cities in the future, but with reference to energy, environment, and resilience. So first of all, explain to you why I picked this topic, because my career path would be this. Came back to Singapore in '69, worked in public housing, then in urban planning, then in private sector, and now also chairman of Center for Liveable Cities. So I grew up with this Singapore urbanization experience, but by working outside Singapore and look back on Singapore, I must say I look back at Singapore with wonder. It's a wonderful place because Singapore offered me as an urban laboratory, gave me lots of opportunity to do research on fundamental issues on urban planning. Now, when I was preparing the subject matter, I tried to pick up the keywords from the organizers, like Singapore today, Singapore in the next 50 years, and also issues of climate and sea level, and how do we cope with all those problems. And also cities in general, population, environment, ecology, and can we use virtual infrastructure of help. So my thought was that after looking through this, the issues that we want to really address is how would economy attract population and create issues of sustainability, and how can we provide intelligent planning with the help of technology for a better world. And this is the trend of thought that I'll be presenting to you. To start with, urban development in a nutshell. If you see these 3 layers of blue, one is a deep sea, the second is a shallow sea, the third is a sky. Now, so there are all kinds of ideas expressed about urban planning, all kinds of ideas, culture, economy, sociology, and so on. But how do you transform the ideas into physical environment? Because ideas would not mean very much unless they are expressed in physical environment. But the challenge is that after you create a physical environment based on the ideas, it will take about 20 years or more to know whether these ideas work or not. This is the biggest challenge of urban planning. So we need a kind of very, I would say, sound process of translation through sieving through the ideas, introducing technology, assessing the technological capability, plan the city, implement, and do the design. And after we do that, the physical environment emerge, and also the activities of a city emerge, because the whole purpose of creating a city is to create space for activities. So the key issue would be the middle part, the translation part. How do you translate ideas into physical environment? So I'm going to just address this into 1, how do we sieve ideas? 2, what's the meaning of technology to urban planning? 3, key ideas about urban planning, and 4, the implementation issues. So I'm going to take you through these 4 points: sieving through ideas, technology, planning, and implementation. Because if we get these things done well, I believe we can reduce a lot of the challenges on energy to our urban environment. First of all, sieving ideas. It's my view that while the world is changing very, very fast, but fundamental needs of human beings remains unchanged for centuries. We still want to have stability, safety, we want a romantic environment, livable environment, nice gardens, and so on. They don't change. So we must remember in a city to plan for those things. So before we look to the future, must know the past and know the present. It's too easy to not to spend time to know the past and present and leap straight into the future. Then we're not solving the problem. So when we see the idea, keep that principle in mind. The second is a city is about a system. How do we create a system? And it's my belief that we can create an urban system which will be relevant, useful for centuries, provided we understand the fundamental human needs. And then third is that because we always talk about creating a beautiful city, but in my view, first of all, if a city is a human being, make the city healthy, because if a city is healthy, it will look beautiful regardless of what ugly clothes it puts on. But if a city, like a human being, is sickly, no matter how beautiful the clothes are, you still cannot make them beautiful. So the first thing is healthier cities. So that's when you see through the ideas, focus on that issue. Now, my attitude to technology is not being disrespectful, but this is from a planner's point of view. Technology is very important. In fact, in my profession, particularly in architecture, I make use of technology very often. Recently, I just achieved designing a building for INSEAD and achieved 42% energy saving. Okay, that's how much, apparently it's the second highest in Singapore. So I'm not discounting technology, but behind technology, we must have good design. It's too dangerous to leap straight into technology. If we have good design and then aided by technology, I think we are going to make use of technology more effectively. So technology basically is like the tonic on a healthy body. It enhances but cannot replace good design. And in fact, it's my belief that if we plan the city intelligently, the city would depend less on technology, less on energy, use less on energy. And actually, then we can make use of technology more effectively and more efficiently. That's the second part about technology. Now, this third part is, I'm going to use the word intelligent repeatedly in this third part, because I feel that we must, whatever we do, we must do it intelligently. Use our brain to think through the issue. So if you come out of, at the end of this lecture, if you feel that you don't want to hear the word intelligent anymore, I understand. But I feel that we're going to be sorry. Now, what happened typically in a city is that the government has a will to create a good city, and then they leap straight into architecture, nothing in between. Now, that is a very common situation, and that is partly explained for the very bad cities we see around us. And so I suggest that after you have the will, you must set good vision. You must quantify what you are designing, okay? And then you must devise suitable strategies to do these things. And then start planning. It's only then you start planning. You start creating urban image, and you start working out the implementation procedure. But at the same time, we look at the software. How do we make use of energy and the creative talents of the private sector and public sector to make the city work? This is a big picture. And in a short time, I'm going to just skip through this very quickly. Set vision includes sieving ideas and find out what the government or the people want, look at the people's wishes. And the second part, to try to find out how big is the city, what kind of density we think would be good for the city, and hopefully good for the energy saving. And then after that, we will work out intelligently again what actually is the meaning of a city. Because sometimes they ask a lot of experienced people, I said, tell me what is the optimal distance between two parallel expressways. 100% of them cannot give me the answer. If we cannot, how are you going to plan the city? Okay, so you have to assess a planning approach, then work out the kind of the big urban structure to say, how do we generally plan? What's the concept of a city to achieve the goals that we're setting up for ourselves? It's only then that we start planning. We plan the master plan, the detailed plan. At the same time, we look at the environmental issue, ecological issue, environmental issue, energy issues. And only then we do urban design. And after that, we don't forget to pass a law and then find out an efficient enforcement system, implementing those things. Then you get to do architecture. Very exhausting, but fortunately in Singapore we went through every step of that. And I think that partly explains why Singapore seems to work and seems to be workable and livable. Now, but see, if we look at the vision and look at the legislation enforcement part, in Singapore we do this. We set a vision, we do a master plan, detailed plan, urban design, and we at the same time do the infrastructure master plan to make the infrastructure efficient, detailed master plan, detailed infrastructure plan in engineering design, very systematically, pass legislation, do the promotion, and then develop. But a very important secret weapon of Singapore is that we have a public housing policy. That helps us clear the land, and therefore, with the land, clearing the land, of course, we create the land for public housing, but also create the land for commercial development, industrial development, and infrastructure development. The reward is handsome. We have a functional city. Because the new towns is planned in a way to enhance walkability, minimize the use of traffic, of cars. So it's walkable, low carbon, and we supply land for whatever the city needs. We create home ownership for all, and of course, we enhance economic development. And that's, then we look at the planning side. What do we do? I want to propose that we look at the right value and with the help of science and art. Value means you must have a humanist heart to look after the welfare of the people. The science, you have to have a scientist head to plan the city intelligently. Arts, don't forget, if you plan the city intelligently and the city is not beautiful, it's still not livable. We still have the artist's eyes. And to do so, there's a proper procedure. We have to look far, means long term. Big means look at the whole city, not in bits and pieces. And we have to pay attention to function before you talk about images. We have to pay attention to the health of the city before you look at the beauty. We, at the same time, don't forget to conserve ecology, conserve heritage. And therefore, basically, we should create a good cake and then put the icing on top of it, and don't just go straight for the icing. And so this 1991 master plan was created with that in mind. So handsome reward, actually you can see best quality living environment in Singapore, happiest place in Asia, greener city in Asia, and of course, business-friendly country. And so I just want to end up by saying that if you look at the Scandinavian country, looking at the future now, in the last 60 years, they never stopped themselves from growing. They continuously grew, okay? And therefore, for Singapore to try to think about not growing our population is not realistic. Even in a remote country like Scandinavia, they still cannot stop population growth. So this one, I don't have time to elaborate on this, but I just want to say that the more limited our country's land is, the more we must plan long term. And therefore, I propose we plan from a current 5.5 million to 10 million, because if we really aspire Singapore to remain as a sovereign country, for heaven's sake, plan for the future. And of course, we don't just plan, I'm just a physical planner. We also need policy support, better education, change economic restructuring, higher productivity, and so on, to try to reduce the population growth rate. But despite that, we must plan for the long-term future. Now, what stands between us, that means us means cities around the world, and a better world? Politics and human frailty, we all know. A kind of being seduced by sexy sound bites and not looking at the serious issue, the fundamental issue, and putting all the hope on technology without looking at design or good planning. And also, so we need the knowledge on to know what are the fundamental needs of a city and plan for that. And therefore, we should not underrate the importance of intelligent planning. So my wish for the future on 3 issues: design, technology, and ecology. In the past, again, we must look at the past, like 19th century, early 20th century. Good design. Why? Because they didn't have technology to help them. So everybody must think intelligently, smartly, to create good design. and therefore ecology was good. In the last 100 years, okay, because of increase in technology, and the blind faith we put in technology to solve our environmental issue. So the urban design, the architecture design becomes poorer, less intelligent, ecology becomes poorer. My wish for the future is better design, better technology, and good ecology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liu. Taiha, I have a question for you. Has Singapore really a choice? I mean, in a sense, Singapore, being a city-state, has no choice but to innovate and to try to make sure that when we urbanize from the very start, we bring the environment in, because we do not have a hinterland. And therefore, how do you create green spaces and so on? And I think that this example has shown that the normal trade-off that we normally think about when we talk about a planet-sensitive approach and a people-sensitive approach, normally there's a trade-off. But what you have said is that through a good design, as an architect, a good urban design, good implementation, a good approach, you are able to create a win-win situation. Now, that win-win approach, obviously, we hope will continue into this whole future. So can Singapore, small as it is, actually provide lessons and become a hub of knowledge for an urbanizing world?
I would say that given a very good government, I just want to make it clear, I'm not a PAP member, okay? So, no, I'm totally apolitical. So, but the fact that I stayed in the government for so long was because we had a very good and open-minded government. In fact, I used to often tell my overseas visitor, I said, in Singapore, the highest authority is not the Prime Minister. It's not the President. It's something called the truth. And even in front of the Prime Minister, in front of the President, if you tell them the truth with good reasons, they listen to you. And I think this, to me, is a secret of Singapore's success today. That's the first point. Second point is, yes, it's true that we have very little choice. Our options are highly limited, and that drives us to try harder to create a good environment. But I would like to caution by saying that the world, particularly in Asia, the countries don't have much choices either. 60% of the world population live in Asia, 60%, on 30% of the land. High density is a necessity, and we are constantly short of agricultural land. In fact, China is just as land short as Singapore. And therefore, if we do not try to plan intelligently, say in China or in India and Indonesia, I think we'll be in trouble. But if Asia does well in its urban environment, not only it enjoys a good urban life, it also helps to save the world. So this is the sacred mission of Asia. And I would say that it's not an issue of trade-off. It's just that we have no choice. Asia, Singapore equally have no choice but to try to plan intelligently and then use as little energy as possible.
Thank you. Let's open it up to the floor. I have been allowed to take an extra 15 minutes, right, Gillian? Because we started a little bit late. So let's invite speakers to the mic, if there are any.
No question.
Really, you were so perfect? I think you won your tea. Okay, then let me then be provocative and just ask our two panelists. Oh, okay, there's one, please. I think it's Dr. Wong, right, Eileen? Yeah.
I'm Aileen Wong from UNISIM. I have a question for Dr. Liu as well as the other town planners in the hall, if they care to answer. I agree with Dr. Liu that when we do planning, and a long-term one, then the effects will come about maybe only in 2 or 3 decades. Now, so for the future of uncertainty, especially in terms of the employment structure and employment patterns, which is really one of the basic human needs that the planner need to satisfy. Now, how do you predict the shape of the economy to come? And if you cannot predict it, how do you plan for the facilities or the infrastructure for economic activities?
Thank you, Eileen.
Well, thank you. I personally don't think that anybody can predict the future of economy, because if you look at the industrialization history in Singapore, we started with labor intensive, then capital intensive, then skill intensive, then now it's this R&D and so on. It's changing all the time. In fact, the government is aware of that, to the point that whereas commercial land and residential land, the lease is 99 years, whereas industrial land, the lease is as low as 15 years, because we expect the industry to change. So the job of a planner is to look at the general pattern and create land spaces as well as the building spaces. It's like creating a library shelf, and what books would the library put in? Nobody can predict. We just let it add or distract or change and change. So this is the job of a planner. Why I emphasize on the long term is because you have seen a lot of cities where the airport is in the middle of the city. That's because they plan short term, and therefore the city overtakes the airport position. But if we plan long term, we don't have to see that. But in Singapore, because our land is particularly small, we have to plan long term. Otherwise, our city will fall into the water, and that's something I don't want to see.
All right, Kishore, thank you, Dr. Liu.
Thank you, Kishore Mahbubani. This is a question to Peter. Peter, you know Singapore very well. You've been here dozens and dozens of times. You know our policy makers very well. You know our thinking very well. What Singapore needs now for the next 50 years is sort of big alternative ideas. And as you know, one of the alternative ideas I put across is that Singapore is the perfect laboratory for a zero-car ownership society, where all you need is a smartphone and a driverless car appears, and you get to your destination. You don't have to worry about the car, COE, etc., etc. So that's one big alternative idea. But from your point of view, apart from having nuclear plants of Bill Gates type for Singapore, what are the big alternative ideas that Singapore could consider for the next 50 years? And after you've given your answer, I wonder whether Taika would like to comment on it.
Thanks, Kishore. Well, you mentioned one that I think is actually a very interesting one. Look, first of all, it is very clear, and I serve on the RIEC, that Singapore has already been investing in the research in a number of arenas, like electric vehicles, like battery technology, urban design. The Urban Land Authority is doing research on improved urban design as well. So I think, first of all, the most important thing at the moment is good research. And you are already investing in substantial research in a number of key areas: solar power, electric batteries, electric vehicles. Secondly, there is a real passion, and I'm one of those guys who loves driving cars. I'm a car guy. But 100 years ago, I probably would have been a horse guy. And try to get my horses to go really fast. Now, most of us don't take horses to work anymore. Those people who want to ride horses go off to ride at riding parks and the like and so on. And I think one day that'll be the case of automobiles. We'll take our a special Ferrari and go drive at a place where it's permissible. But the rest of us will actually use individual vehicles that we won't own, like you suggest. We'll call them up with our smart device of whatever we suggest. Most of those cars that sit idle all day long in parking garages or in people's homes will actually not be there anymore. Taxi cab drivers aren't going to like this much, but unfortunately it's going to be automated vehicles, just as you suggest. And so I think one of the things we can do is get out of our cars. And into what will be essentially automated vehicles, radically reduce the land use implications of that, and dramatically improve the efficiency of that. The second big thing is how do we use, as Professor Liu suggested, integrated design. Building design, transportation design, environmental design, all wrapped up together to reduce the environmental footprint of all activity. And again, we've seen there are better cities and worse cities in that respect. And if you look around the world, you see in some places, really great examples of urban design that have improved efficiency. So for example, even in places like Brazil or Colombia, what you've seen is new kinds of bus transit systems that lead to dramatically improved efficiency of movement. So there's a lot to be learned from other places in that respect. And then finally, I think it has to do with individual behavior. That is, I think people want to live well, they want to live comfortably, and so on. But I go back to something that Minister Tharman suggested, individual responsibility. And that is to encourage us all to be stewards of the planet, stewards of the environment, and so on. And I think Singaporeans tend toward being responsible. But I think you can be an example for your neighbors in particular in terms of what constitutes responsible day-to-day behavior in the choices we make about the things we consume and how we consume them.
Thank you. I think we are running out of time, unless there's some more very pressing question from the floor, is there? All right, yes, yeah. Very quickly.
Very high.
Yes,
my name is Li Chong. I want to ask a question to Dr. Lim about the balance between sort of new design and heritage sites in Singapore, and your view on that. We hear of many things coming down and getting replaced. Parts of Bukit Brown, Rochor Center is coming down in a very big way. So there's one school of thought that says we need to remember our history, and we're very visual people, so we need to see sites. But some of these sites are actually coming down. So what is your view in terms of urban planning and heritage sites that you would recommend that we keep in mind for the next 50 years?
Well, first of all, I have led the government for about 23 years, so I don't know the latest policy thinking, but I would say that in fairness to my URA colleagues, when I was in URA, I actually helped convince the government to save about 5,500 historical buildings. And now the record is 7,000 and over. And so it appears to me that my URA colleagues continue to value the heritage buildings. And so this is the kind of big background. But specifically, why certain buildings get taken down and so on, that I'm afraid I'm not familiar with. But in my view, it is totally important for a city to keep their worthy old buildings as memories. And Singapore, despite maybe mishaps here and there, has a track record that we should all be proud of. And despite our land shortage, we must continue to preserve the historical building. And if you calculate the land taken up by the worthy historical building, it's not a huge amount. It will not affect the healthy growth of Singapore in the future. And I don't think the two things are in conflict or incompatible with each other.
Thank you very much. I think we have come to the end of our session, and I'll just take a couple of minutes to sum up, because this is what the organizers would like me to do. It's not an easy session to sum up again, but the simple message is that we have no choice. We have to reduce our carbon footprint if we want to have a future. And we do this by having to change our energy systems from one that is highly fossil fuel dependent and will be increasingly fossil fuel dependent unless we find ways of leapfrogging to new solutions that, and also lead to a clean energy revolution. And we had discussions of what that could be in terms of renewables, in terms of technologies, but also in the future even to consider nuclear energy. We've looked at how to reduce our carbon footprint by looking at urbanization and cities, because this is where most of the consumption and also the emission happens. 70% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from our cities, and most of it would come from our buildings as well as from our transport system. So it is critical that we learn to design our cities in such a way we change the design of our cities to address climate change. We change the way we operate our buildings to address climate change. We also change the way people move. But at the center of all these changes, whilst we build the environment into our urbanization strategy, we also have to put people at the center, and it doesn't have to be a trade-off. Good urban environment with green spaces reduces air pollution, and an integrated city that is walkable also improve the use of time and leisure for people. And therefore, together, if we design ourselves and our future well to have the urban future that we want, we would be able to have livable and creative cities that will improve the quality of life for all. That is the message of this session. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy your tea.